Hello and welcome to a special programme which I've been asked to prepare by a number of our clients to look at money laundering reporting, in particular money laundering reporting as a result of the recent events in Russia and Ukraine. Obviously, many of you will know that David Winch and I present a training course on money laundering reporting, particularly for accountants and tax advisors. And hopefully accountants, tax advisors, lawyers watching this will also share it with their clients who may well also be affected by money laundering regulations and the need to make sure they're doing the right thing throughout this particular situation and, of course, generally. I've already mentioned David Winch is a money laundering reporting expert and the ideal person to talk us through some of the issues that people are going to face at the moment and also some of the consequences that their clients could face. And we start, David, by just, funnily enough, in the training program that we normally do, there's always been an example that we've struggled to come up with. And I think, sadly, we now have that example. The question that we're looking at here is, if I'm in a position where I am going through the money laundering reporting process, I've asked to see the client's passport, I've asked to see a utility bill, perhaps, and I've satisfied myself that that person is okay. You always told me, you satisfy yourself the first time, some future event might make you decide you want to see more, but we could never really think of a good example. I'm guessing if you have clients with Slovak sounding names, not to suggest all people with Slovak sounding names are involved, of course, then maybe that's the thing that will make us think, do you know what? Maybe we should have another look.
Yeah, I think there's kind of a couple of aspects to this, isn't there? One is that it could be that we have a client who is the second cousin 3 times removed of some Russian or Ukrainian leader or something, and now finds themselves on the list of people that we're not supposed to be doing business with, the sanctions list. And we aren't going to know that as accountants unless we do a check. And I suppose there's 2 ways of doing that check. One is to go on the HM Treasury website, pull down the list of all the people with names and try and sort of work your way down and see if your client's there. That's actually going to be quite difficult because some of these names have alternative spellings in our alphabet. Some of them have similar names. Sometimes the first names can appear in a different order, or a name can appear as like a double barrel name or not. And so you might think, well, I wonder if that actually refers to my client or not. I'm not quite clear. It's going to be horribly messy to do it that way. The other way is, although it's not mandatory, to use an electronic check system, one of the commercial electronic check systems, feed into that the information you have about the client, and that will either give you a green light or a red light, or possibly an in-between, and you'll try and work it out from there. But yes, it might be that Mr. Somebody that you've been dealing with for 2 or 3 years perfectly happily is now somebody that you're prohibited from dealing with, and you're not going to know unless you do a recheck. So I'm not suggesting that you do a recheck of every butcher, baker and candlestick maker that you've got on your client list. But there may be some where you think, I wonder if there might be an issue with this particular client.
And the point is, it's always been a subjective process. You know, we joke about the fact that you look at the passport and then you put a paper in a file and say, we never need to worry about that again. And of course, even now, some people will decide that's the course of action to take. But we must make sure that within our own opinion, within the money laundering reporting officer's opinion, we are in a situation where we have collected suitable data to satisfy ourselves, first of all, that the person is a genuine human being with that name, that address, whatever, but also to be satisfied that we do not think they're involved in criminal activity, profiting from criminal activity, or potentially funding other criminal activity.
Or that they're, as we say, on the sanctions list, because your client themselves may not be involved in criminal activity, but if they happen to be related to somebody, they might find themselves on a sanctions list, and you need to know that. Otherwise, you're going to be in some serious bother if you're dealing with somebody who's on a sanction list and you weren't aware. And also, I suppose, when the supervisory bodies are doing their checks, as they routinely do, it would be sensible for them to ask the question, what are you doing about this? Have you thought about, do I need to do some extra checks? Do I need to revisit some things? And the answer you want to give is, yes, I thought about this and I'm doing X, Y, Z.
And while we're talking, as we normally do, about accountants, tax advisors, this is also very relevant to some other industries as well. And I guess the two most obvious that jump off the page would be estate agents and also kind of high dealers, high value dealers. So art galleries, things like that, yes, must make sure that they are watching out for exactly what's going on. Even long-standing customers, do we need to go back and check, as you say, the sanctions list? Do we need to electronically verify these people just to satisfy ourselves that we're doing the right thing?
Yes, yes. And I'm afraid we're not going to make any money out of that. It's just another cost. It's another pain. We've got to do it, but yes, we should be doing it.
Okay. And normally one of the checks we might look into doing would be to go to company's house and satisfy ourselves that the company exists as a director, they exist and what have you. But actually, we need to remind ourselves that company's house, while it does what it's meant to do, I guess, isn't the best resource for this because it does have a number of weaknesses.
Yeah, as you know, there is new legislation suddenly appeared in Parliament over the last few days, dealing with or responding to the situation in Ukraine and Russia and dealing with what we call unexplained wealth orders. And we've been promised for a long time that there would be new legislation about Companies House. Now, that hasn't appeared yet. One gathers that it is now much higher up the priorities than it was a couple of months ago. And part of that is about Companies House at the moment is basically a giant filing cabinet. You send stuff to Companies House, they will file it. They won't check a set of accounts, for example, to see if they add up, to see if the balance sheet balances, all sorts of rubbish in terms of annual accounts can go into Companies House and they'll file it. There have literally been companies incorporated with Donald Duck as a director, and they'll do it because they don't check these things. They don't have the resources. That's not part of their role. But the plan is to change their role from a mere filing cabinet role to a more regulatory role. And as I understand it, the plan is particularly in relation to company incorporations and company directors, not particularly in relation to accounts. So we will still see the small limited company, one-man band, who perhaps prepares his own accounts. He's seen the adverts on the telly. You don't need an accountant. You just press a button and out come the annual figures and you send them off. And that will still be okay as far as Companies House is concerned, as I understand it, which I know a lot of our accountant friends will moan about, but there it is. But in terms of incorporations, in terms of directors, the idea is that Companies House, in effect, will do an ID check on directors, much the same as we do on our clients, to see that they genuinely exist as people and that it's not just a pure scam. Now, I have to say, if you want to use a limited company to operate a scam, I could tell you very quickly how to do it, but I'm not going to. But it isn't difficult. It really isn't difficult to do that. But it's going to be a bit more difficult when that new Companies House legislation comes in. But that is not the legislation that's been introduced over the last few days. That is something to look forward to over the next year or so.
So as far as we're concerned, in terms of checking the accuracy of people, the existence of the correct number of directors, the names of the directors, everything else for a particular company, and shell companies and companies that own other companies, it's huge structures that can exist. It's not that by ticking a box by saying we looked at Companies House and it's there. What we're saying is even the government are acknowledging a need to change the legislation from what it is currently, which in a way proves to us that we shouldn't just take it as gospel, that if that's the name that appears, that's the correct data. We might want to check in a different way, particularly in the current circumstances where we're slightly nervous about the data that we're being offered?
Yes. And while we're on this subject, again, unfortunately, when things need to improve, somehow the burden always seems to land on us and not on anybody else. And just a reminder that in terms of persons of significant control, it is already the position that when we take on a new client, we are required to check the company's house PSC information, and if it's not right, to do something about that and get it put right. Actually, the legislation requires us to inform company's house that it's not right, but the realistic, sensible thing to do is to inform the client that it's not right and say, let's sort this out. Again, at the moment, that requirement only applies when we take on a new client. It doesn't apply on a continuing basis year after year, but it seems as if that would be a sensible amendment to the legislation that we might see coming forward when it comes out.
Okay. To move on to a different topic altogether, when we look at money laundering regulations and money laundering reporting, we tend to focus on the profiting from a criminal activity. The activity has already occurred and we have profited from it. The most obvious in tax, of course, is tax evasion. There is money in their bank because they haven't paid tax. That is tax evasion. That's a criminal act. So they have profited from it. There is a different piece of legislation relating to funding of terrorism. And that is worth us just highlighting. It's the other way around is the starting point.
Yeah. Yes. We always say money laundering, tax evasion, and brackets, terrorism, and then move on. Things have changed a little bit, haven't they, in the world? And as you say, with the terrorism legislation, the issue is this money going to be used to fund terrorism? Whereas with the tax and so on, has this money been derived from tax evasion that's occurred? With terrorism, the money comes first. And so it's not proceeds of terrorism, it's money to be used in terrorism. And that's much more difficult, isn't it, to establish or to establish that it's not. So if somebody is worried about, say, the situation in Russia and wants to send their family some money to make sure that they're okay, is that what's happening? Or might there be something a bit more sinister? And do we have to consider whether we need to make a suspicious activity report about some financial transactions in relation to terrorism? What I would say is that in terms of actually completing a suspicious activity report, the report is the same, whether it's terrorism or money laundering, but there are different boxes to tick. And as you can imagine, as far as the National Crime Agency are concerned, if they see something that says terrorism on it, they jump to much more quickly than if they see something that says somebody might not have paid all the VAT on his takings. And so there is I was going to say a slightly different procedure. It's not a different procedure. It's a different way of completing the form. And so you need to be aware of that and to be careful about how you complete the form to make sure that it gets the right attention at the National Crime Agency. Okay.
And if I could this might sound a ridiculous question and politically is quite a difficult one to ask. Hopefully our viewers will forgive me if I offend anybody in this question. The word terrorism, obviously, in our minds, we know what that means. But basically, I guess my question is, who gets to decide who is the terrorist and who is the vulnerable individual? I was watching the news before we recorded this, and a Russian person was referring to the Ukrainians as terrorists. Now, clearly, your decision to send money to a Ukrainian fund, we don't actually know it's being spent on blankets or food or baby formula or whatever it might be. Now, I'm not for 1 second suggesting that the definition there is accurate, but how do we decide at what point we want to call it terrorism? At what point are we reporting it under that heading? Because clearly a lot of people have different views on which is the terrorist.
Yeah, I suppose from some views, some of the things that the UK government is doing is supporting terrorism, if you want to call it that. I think technically terrorism is kind of defined in UK legislation, and we have to look at UK legislation because we're in the UK, is defined as involving the use of force to change a political situation. I suppose from a Russian point of view, they are saying, well, we are liberating the Ukrainian people from a Nazi-style government. And we are freedom fighters, if you like, for them. From a UK government point of view, the boot is on the other foot. But we're in the UK, we're using UK legislation. I think we've got to use a UK frame of reference as to what we would describe as terrorism. I think terrorist financing has to be about use of force by non-government forces to bring about political change or to attempt to bring about political change.
Okay. And as we've already said, if we have any suspicions that that is happening, then we must make sure we go through the correct reporting procedure. And as you've already mentioned, it could feel like a relatively it could look, I should say, like a relatively genuine approach for a person of interest to send money to some sort of fund somewhere in Eastern Europe. And actually, we might need to satisfy ourselves, yeah, we're happy that is for humanitarian reasons or what have you. And if not, better to report than not to report, I think is the point we would probably make there.
Yes, in terms of Middle East conflict, we have heard of situations where, let's say, parents have been supporting a teenager or 20-something-year-old son or daughter to go out to the Middle East and fight for the cause. Now, depending on what the cause is, that can be funding of terrorism. And we have seen people, parents prosecuted for sending money to their children. Again, the situation in Ukraine and Russia is about governments rather than about non-government forces. So I think, strange as it may seem, that probably doesn't come within the terrorism legislation because it is governments fighting each other rather than non-government groups fighting each other. Okay.
And then the sort of final part of our chat really is what happens next, I guess. I don't mean politically, who knows, but what, in terms of money laundering reporting, there are concerns over what will happen to clients, to various business people, if the government then suspect that something is wrong, money laundering reporting, what have you. And there are two things we need to talk about. One gets a lot of publicity, and we haven't really seen it work. The other gets very little publicity and actually is quite a big hammer to hit somebody with. Let's start with the first one, which is unexplained wealth orders. And they haven't hit the news as we thought they might.
No, they were brought in, I think, effectively about 4 years ago. And the idea was that they would be a real crackdown on bribery and corruption and so on. Because if somebody had an asset worth at least £50,000, and if they were either a person involved in serious crime, and we can come back to what serious crime is in the UK, or they were a PEP, politically exposed person, then they could be asked to explain where the money came from to buy this asset. So if they're riding around in a Bentley, how did you afford that Bentley? And the idea was that would be quite a crushing blow, and people would be pulled up short having to answer these questions. In practice, I believe there's only been about 4 unexplained wealth orders obtained over the past few years, and they haven't been totally effective at all. And part of the reason for that is that if you stop somebody and say, right, where'd you get the £100,000 to buy this very smart car? They will say, well, I got it from XYZ Limited. Where did XYZ Limited get their money from? Well, they got it from ABC Limited, and so on. And it just runs into the sand. They're not going to say, well, actually, I took a massive bribe for doing some deal, and I put the money in my building society, and then I bought this smart car. No, that isn't what you're hearing. And unexplained wealth orders have been challenged by the people who've been subject to them. In quite a lot of cases, they've been overturned. They haven't proved to be a powerful weapon in revealing where particularly foreign money has come from. But technically, I mentioned serious crime. Technically, serious crime includes things like VAT evasion, income tax evasion, these sort of things which our clients might get up to. I mean, fortunately, it's not been the case, although technically it's possible for HMRC to turn up to the local pub and say to the publican, that's a very smart car out there. Here's an unexplained wealth order. Can we see your takings record? No, they're not doing that with other unexplained wealth orders. They are targeting the people with the £10 million mansions and so on, and understandably. But equally, those people with all that money are able to get expensive lawyers and accountants to produce all the explanations. And very often there is apparently a legitimate source for the money. Whether if you go behind and behind and behind and behind and behind and behind that source, you might get to something illegitimate. Not so easy to do. So unexplained wealth orders haven't been a big hit. And where the government have lost cases, they've actually had to pay the costs of the other side. So they've actually been out of pocket. That law is going to be changed a bit to tilt the scales a little bit more in favour of the prosecution. And that's part of the legislation that's been introduced this month into Parliament. And
what will that change of legislation mean for people in the UK?
Precious little in practice, I think. We're still not going to see HMRC turning up in the pub with an unexplained wealth order and asking about the takings. The idea is simply to make it more effective against the high roller, the person with the multi-million-pound mansion. Maybe it'll work and maybe it won't.
But there is a second possibility that the revenue particularly have the power, and we've heard it on the news in the last few days, of course, the idea of freezing orders. And whilst we're watching the news and hearing of people having yachts seized and things like that, in fact, the revenue already has a power that, and the government generally has a power, that means it could freeze a bank account so easily that the first time an individual might know about it is when their credit card doesn't work in the supermarket.
Yeah, this is something that HMRC are using, and it's very rough justice, if you like. But what we are seeing is that you might have somebody who's in business and in business in a substantial way. I'm not talking about £5,000 turnover. I'm talking about a chunky business who, for whatever reason, has never told HMRC that they exist. Nothing is happening about income tax, corporation tax, PAYE, VAT, any of this stuff. All of it's just not happening. And yet there's here this substantial business. And HMRC get wind of it. And then what they can do, and what they are doing, is they are getting hold of the bank account details, getting in touch with the bank, getting information from the bank, copy bank statements and so on, all without the customer knowing. I was going to say the taxpayer knowing, but taxpayer isn't the right word in this context. All without their customer knowing. And they've got all this information. And if they see, I had one case where a chap had, he'd done about £3 million worth of business over a period of years. He had 600,000 standing to the credit of his bank current account. Wouldn't we all like to be in that position? And lo and behold, goes to the hole in the wall and his card doesn't work. And what's happened? Well, what's happened is HMRC have got wind of him. As a result, I think in his case, of doing an ordinary investigation on somebody he was doing business with and seeing his invoices and just checking it back and thinking, he doesn't exist. Getting the bank statements, got the bank balance, they've frozen the bank account using an account freezing order, which they can get in the magistrate's court based on a balance of probabilities. And what that does is freezes the account for a period of up to 2 years for things to be investigated and resolved. So it's something that magistrates are kind of reasonably happy to give because they're thinking, well, this is not final. This is just hold everything. We'll sort it out. Well, in terms of if you're running a business and your bank account's frozen, it's not simply, oh, we'll just wait and see what happens. It's like, oh my goodness, what are we going to do? Then having frozen the account and got some more information, HMRC can go back to the magistrates and say, we now think that this is connected with some form of criminality, in practice tax evasion, tax hasn't been declared. We want the whole balance forfeit to the Crown. So it's not a case of let's work out how much tax is due, let's do some accounts, let's do a COP9 inquiry and interest and penalties. None of that. We'll just say, right, here's the bank balance, there's £600,000 in this bank account, we'll have it. And unless the account holder can put forward good reason why it shouldn't be forfeit, he just loses the lot. As I say, very rough and ready justice, but it's very effective from HMRC's point of view. None of this business of let's spend a few years corresponding with an accountant. It's just, yeah, we'll have that money. Thank you very much.
So when it comes to unexplained wealth orders, we are unlikely to see those with our clients. Obviously, if our clients are on a sanction list, we would expect to see certain things cropping up. But actually, it's those freezing orders that are the most likely things. I mean, hopefully we don't see them either, but they're the most likely things we would see. But in terms of the current state of the world, the answer is there's a whole range of things we should be watching out for. Again, hoping that none of it applies to us or our clients, but an awful lot of things we should be watching out for, double checking and satisfying ourselves that we're in the right place, our clients are in the right place, but also understanding what would the consequences be should anybody choose to go after it. That would be the main points, I guess, from what we've said.
Yes. And I think in terms of account freezing orders, we might find those applied to somebody, as I say, that the revenue have never heard of. So it's possible our accountant friends here will find somebody knocking on the door saying, hey, this has happened to me. Can you explain what's going on? Well, now at least they can give a little bit of an explanation as to what's going on and try and help.
Okay. David Winch, as ever, thank you very much indeed for that. Do remember, if you would like further information about money laundering reporting, the requirements, and to work through our training, have a look on our website, ptptraining.com, and you can find full information there. Also remember that this year, because it would be entirely inappropriate for us to profit from what is currently happening in the world, all of the profits we make from money laundering reporting that you buy from now on for the rest of 2022, all of that will be donated to the UNICEF Ukraine Fund. Do have a look at it if you need that training. If not, sleep well, keep out of trouble, and perhaps we'll see you on another course in the future.